Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the LSE. My name is Denisa Kostovicova, and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Government, and I'm also a member of the conflict research group that is hosting this event tonight. Every day on television, in the social media, in the newspapers, we are reminded of many ways in which women are involved in conflict and war. Many are killed, injured, or raped. Others blow themselves up. And at the same time, more women are joining the military and international peacekeeping missions. So do these images and developments tell us the real story of women's enrollment in war? Is women's presence, does it equate with power and equality? What is the intersection between women, violence, and victimhood? Tonight, we will debate topic women in conflict, and we will attempt to glean the real and complex stories that are behind these images and developments. We will speak about conflict from the perspective of women. And what is common to all our speakers tonight is that they put issues of gender at the forefront of their analysis of conflict and security. And the event tonight is particularly exciting because we bring together academia and the arts to make sense of this challenging topic. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panel tonight. I'm delighted to introduce Helen Benedict. Helen Benedict is an award-winning novelist and journalist and playwright, specializing in issues of social justice, and professor of journalism at Columbia University in New York. In 2009, she wrote the book, The Lonely Soldier, The Private War of Women Serving in Iraq. The book documents the stories of women in the US military who served in Iraq and many challenges that they faced on the way, including sexual assault and harassment from their fellow soldiers. Her writings motivated an ongoing class action suit against the Pentagon on behalf of women and men who were sexually assaulted in the military. It also inspired a 2012 Oscar-nominated documentary, The Invisible War, in which she appears. Her work on women soldiers won the James Aronson Award for Social Justice Journalism. Helen Benedict has authored 10 other books and has won numerous other media and book awards. Our event tonight is inspired by the play The Lonely Soldier Monologues. The play is told in the words of women that Helen has interviewed for her book. The play opens at the Cockpit in London next Wednesday, 6th of May. So I thought it might be exciting to use the opportunity, the play and this issue, to invite Helen to speak to us and engage experts who are studying and writing on these issues from an academic perspective to debate conflict and war from the perspective of women. And therefore, I'm very glad to welcome Katherine Brown, who sits next to Helen. Dr. Brown is a lecturer in Defense Studies at the Defense Studies Department at King's College London. She previously taught at the University of Southampton, and her primary research and publications consider the issues related to terrorism, counterterrorism, and gender. And also joining us is ours, Dr. Marsha Henry. She is an associate professor and co-director of the MPhil PhD program in gender at the Gender Institute. She taught previously at the University of Bristol, University of British Columbia, Open University, and Warwick University. She is the author, together with Paul Highgate, of Insecure Spaces, Peacekeeping, Power and Performance in Haiti, Kosovo, and Liberia. Please join me in giving our speakers a warm LSE welcome. I said this evening is particularly special as we bring together the arts and the academia. And therefore, I'm really glad to be able to introduce Pravin Menon Johansson. Where's Prav? Here. She's theater director and producer, and the actors, sitting here in the first row, who are performing in the Lonely Soldier Monologues. Prav has brought Helen Benedict's play to London, And so I would like to invite Prav to tell us a few words about this project, and then we'll be treated to a short preview of the play. Prav.
Thank you very much, Denisa. When I read the play in 2012, I was very moved by the stories. They expose the truths of war and the enemy within the military. So in 2013, we did a reading at the Arts Theatre West End, and it was really interesting doing the reading because we had an overwhelming response from the audience, which was said, we need these voices, they need to be heard, and it's very thought-provoking. However, one of the interesting things about the play is it is a US military play. And one of the people who came to see the reading said to me, and he was in the UK Army, he said, Prav, I'm just going to say one thing to you. It's an American problem. It couldn't possibly happen in the UK. And unfortunately, in 2014, because of the case of Anne-Marie Element, Corporal Anne-Marie Element, who committed suicide in 2011, the coroner at her suicide said the following: bullying and the lingering effect of an alleged rape were factors in the suicide. And Emily Norton from the human rights organisation Liberty, who represented the family, said the following. She said, soldier or civilian, your human rights require protection. So it's very important to the UK, and because of all these things that happened in 2014, I launched a Kickstarter campaign. We had a great response and we were successfully funded. And following that, we've had Arts Council funding so that the play is now going to be staged. And during the run, we are supporting Liberty to highlight their military justice campaign, to bring it out into the public so that it can be discussed and debated. And the other thing, the ethos of PMJ Productions is through the work, through plays that we garner, debate and hopefully change. And we've widened the debate to include other topics, and we have Laura Bates from the Everyday Sexism Project who will be coming to do a Q&A. And the other thing is we're discussing domestic and sexual violence in the UK with the leader, the founder of Rape Crisis, not the founder, but one of the doctors from Rape Crisis. So I do hope that you can come to the play, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you very much.
Everything we've done in Iraq is a lie, and I feel very ashamed that I didn't see it sooner and stand up against it. I was a drill sergeant. My job was to teach other people's children how to kill. People ask me, how could I, as a spiritual person, teach people to kill? How, as a mother, could I send my own sons to war? I asked myself that. I bought into the whole thing. I thought it was the honorable thing to do. I can only hope my ancestors will forgive me. Or that I'll be able to forgive myself. Bomb the village, kill the people, throw some napalm in the square. Do it on a Sunday morning, do it on their way to prayer. Ring the bell inside the schoolhouse, watch those kiddies gather round. Kill, 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 kill.
Prav, thank you very much. I hope this sort of gives us sort of a sense of the issues we are going to be discussing tonight, and perhaps make you think that you would like to see the play that opens next week. So what I'll do now is I'll hand it over to Helen. Helen will speak for 10 minutes. Our other panelists will respond, and this will leave us about 30 minutes or so for the questions for the audience. Okay.
Should we stay here? Actually, I'd rather stand up.
Yeah.
I'm going to start with a question for you. How many of you were shocked to hear a soldier say that everything we did in Iraq was a lie just now? Not that many. When the first play came out, people were extremely shocked when the play first came out, and I think they still would be more shocked in the States than here, because the climate of criticism against the war has been much more subdued there because of 9/11. And when the play first came out, it was extraordinary to people to hear soldiers be so critical of the mission in Iraq. And I, myself, was absolutely astonished when I first heard women soldiers speaking like this, speaking so critically of the war and sometimes of the military, even those who'd had 22 years inside the military and whole careers, which led me to the idea to investigate that maybe women soldiers tell different war stories than men do. Traditionally, war has been a man's story. I mean, going back to the ancient Greeks and before, it's always the male bards and the male poets and the male novelists and the male playwrights who've written about war, and that's continued to be true up until today. And I came to see that women, partly because of the way they're treated within the military, have a different perspective, which will bring me to how they're treated in the military. I began this project just wanting to know why women would enlist in the military at a time of war, and what is it like to be a woman soldier in combat. Backing up a little, the Iraq War and the Afghanistan wars, as you might know, are not like old-fashioned warfare with one army battling another in the front line. They're essentially guerrilla warfares in which soldiers and Marines are fighting civilians and insurgents. So you can't draw a line realistically about who's in the front line and who isn't. Therefore, by about 2005, when I began my research, more women in America, more women in the military had already been deployed to Iraq than all American wars put together since World War II, and or more had been wounded and killed. As of today, 283,000 American women have deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan. 800 have been killed, and many, many more wounded. At the same time, as I was asking these questions, why would you as a woman even want to do this? I began to hear many more stories of harassment and sexual assault than I ever expected. I mean, I've written a lot about this subject in civilian life. I know that women are harassed and raped and assaulted way too much in civilian life. But I did not expect to find the frequency I found in the US military, which is 30% of women are sexually assaulted by their comrades at arms. That's almost 1 in 3. If 30% of soldiers were dying of Ebola, or 30% were dying of AIDS, or 30% of male soldiers were getting raped, there would be a worldwide outcry. Harassment is 90%, so it's almost universal. Important to remember that when you're at war, you can't go home from the office. You are working with the people who are treating you like this, day in and day out. You are living with them. There's no escape ever. Furthermore, you've been trained to see them as family. So studies have shown that assault and harassment is experienced emotionally very like incest, because these are people who you've seen as your brothers and your fathers, and as people to watch your back in battle and depend on in war. And that brings me to the subject of victimhood, as we raised for this topic, because it is very, very, very important for soldiers of either men or women not to be seen as victims. They actually tend to hate the word. I found out in my studies that among the enlisted ranks, that's everybody below officers, half the men who enlisted in the military in America, in the Marines and in the Army, had been physically abused as children. Half the women had been sexually abused as children, and many had been both. So we could say that half the forces, at least in those two branches, are joining to escape violent, dysfunctional homes. There are other reasons too. They're joining because what could be stronger and more powerful than being a soldier or a Marine? And what could be less like a victim? So I want to recast this picture a little and point out that I don't see the women in this play or in my book, or the women who have testified to Congress or who appeared in the film The Invisible War about sexual assault in the military, as victims at all. I see them as heroes. It is extraordinarily difficult to blow the whistle in the military, and that applies absolutely to the UK military as well. It is a very self-protected, insular society. It's about building loyalty. Anybody who blows a whistle about no matter how dire the wrongdoing is seen as a snitch, a traitor, a weak soldier, a loser, and is punished, is ostracized, is mocked, is taunted, or is physically punished, or even court-martialed and put in prison under various charges. This is the background of what led Corporal Marie Anne Element to commit suicide. So to speak out, even after you've separated from the military, takes an extraordinary amount of courage. So I do think it's important to bear that in mind. I also have to say that, maybe nearly one in three women are sexually assaulted, but that means 2 in 3 aren't. And I did, of course, meet many in the military who had good experiences, especially if they worked as medics or if they were on base somewhere safe, and felt that they had really grown up in the war and had experienced loyalty from their comrades, and it wasn't all a dire picture. But as I said earlier, 1 in 3 is way too many. It's shocking, and it should be addressed, recognized, and whatever can be done to stop it. I finally would like to just go back to the idea of women telling different stories. There were surveys that I saw early on that about a year into the Iraq War, some 80% of deployed women, again, this is American military, agreed on anonymous surveys or ticked the boxes that said that they thought we should withdraw from Iraq within a year. Whereas some 69% of men did. And it did make me wonder why women were so much more critical. And when I saw the way they're excluded, the way they're bullied, the way they are treated as second-class soldiers, the way they are not allowed in the inner circle, I could see that they weren't buying into or falling prey to, however you want to see it, the loyalty that makes soldiers shut up about injustice, that binds them to each other and buries wrongdoing. They were freer, already feeling like outsiders, to expose these problems. And the results have been good. There have been reforms in the States, really important reforms. There's still a long way to go. But it's a very, very different military now than it was in 2007 when my first article about this piece came out. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I come to you actually from 2 different standpoints. The first one is from my post as a lecturer in the Defence Studies Department, which is actually out in Oxfordshire at the Defence Academy, which means that 98, perhaps 99% of my students are serving military personnel, the majority of whom are from the United Kingdom, but all of whom are officers. So you might think from that description that you would find me somewhat institutionalised, somewhat convinced of all things amazing that the military does, given that's who I work with. But on the other hand, what's been quite interesting is the levels of discussion and debate that we do have around issues of sexual violence and conflict. But I would like to say as well that some of that is very much hidden and also not really discussed very widely. So I'd like to draw that to attention, that we don't have this level of debate in the UK about how women soldiers are treated. Having said that, however, I spend quite a lot of my time arguing for increased cohesion and increased inclusion for women in combat arms and frontline combat roles. And a lot of what I argue is to do with bringing down this idea that women's bodies are necessarily antithetical to the war zone, that somehow women's bodies don't belong and they don't have the capacity for violence. Women do have the capacity for violence, and I think it's too often that we dismiss their participation in war and their participation in conflict as somehow always being about peacekeeping and peacemaking, that somehow they're always on the opposition to war and violence. Most of my actual research is looking at young women who choose to join non-traditional militaries, if you will, terrorist groups, and why they might choose to do so. And I think actually some of the stories that we read in Helen's book and in others about why young women might choose to join an army are actually not that dissimilar to why they may choose to join other armed groups. What I think is really important in our understanding of including looking at why women might join political violent movements is when we consider that yes, their decisions are gendered, but so too are men's. We have to look at how, by looking at women, we also see how men make their decisions as well, and they're impacted that way. So what I'd like to say on that front is that women join armed movements, terrorist organisations, for both personal and political reasons. But this is the same for men. Men join these groups partly because of trauma that they've seen, so too do women. They join it for political reasons, because they may believe in the ideology or the promotion of a particular viewpoint. So we have these two things together. But this leads me to my second point, that it is too often that women's participation in warfare is dismissed. That in fact, when we look at women's participation, we are much keener to present them as victims, to suggest that maybe they're always those who are vulnerable to sexual violence, they're always the ones who have been raped, they're always the ones who are somehow on the wrong side of the gun. However, again, if we look at women's participation, we do find that they do carry out acts of violence against other women, against men, and against civilians, and against other armed forces. So one of the things that I've been working on at the moment is looking at young women from the United Kingdom and why they might go and join the Islamic State. And what I find frustrating is an assumption that they are simply jihadi brides. And this to me is similar to an idea that women who participate in wars, such as in Africa, are sometimes dismissed as just being camp brides, as if they're somehow not soldiers, that they are not fighting, that they have not made political decisions, as well as personal decisions, to engage in these organisations. And I think this is also important because of the impact this has on DDR, so the disarmament process. Because if you fail to recognise women's participation as professionals, as also capable of violence, they then are not able to access the same resources that men are able to do so. So they're often dismissed from some of the retraining and reskilling programs. They don't get the same help to rehabilitate them. Their PTSD is not recognised. But also in amongst all of that, somehow it is simply their sex that matters. It is our obsession with their sex and their sex lives, not theirs, that seems to dominate our understanding of them. Having said that, our obsession with their bodies, with their sex, does suggest something about the symbolic value of women's participation in war. That we might wonder, we can understand why individuals may choose to join, why might young women, but then we also have to ask ourselves, what is the value to the group? What is the value to the armed forces in question? What is the value to the terrorist group in question? And I think what is quite frustrating as well in some of the discussions, such as women in the front line and their role in combat arms, is when it's always assumed to be a negative, that actually somehow it will diminish the strength, or diminish the cohesion, or diminish the ability of a particular group to carry out their professional role, rather than looking at the skill sets that women have over and above their sex and their gender. So I'd like to also stress that in the discussion, when we look at women's political violence, that we look at what can they contribute over and above seeing them first and only as women, but looking at them as that in conjunction with the skills that they have. So, what is it that they can contribute? When we look at some of the narratives of Islamic State, when they say, look, we have women who are joining us, it is actually partly to galvanise other men to join. It is saying, look, if the women are doing it, why aren't you? You're not manly enough, right? And as a part of that, we can then see also how men get roped into war as well. So you can see that as well with some of the campaigns in the Second World War where women would give white feathers to men they assumed were cowards because it was questioning their masculinity as well as demonstrating their femininity by supporting the war effort. But also it can be used to humiliate. If it is a woman that carries out the acts of violence against you, the opponent, if it is a woman who carries out the act of terror, what if it is a woman, for example, that carried out the acts of aggression and violence in Abu Ghraib? And it was. And that was specifically done to silence that violence and the fact they were using those women's femininity to demasculinize and emasculate those young men. And I think that is really important. But it also then points to the simple thing that when we look at men and women and the power relations they have in these organizations, that the symbolic role that they have, having just said we need to look at their skills, is not only their skills, right? They do have these two things coming together. And so I'd also like to suggest that when we focus on women in the armed forces, there's a tendency to simply look at them in terms of their specific skills, such as female engagement teams in Iraq and Afghanistan, as if that's their only function, or if only they were nurses or doctors or performed predominantly gender-acceptable roles within the military. But perhaps we also need to look at what skills they can offer over and above that, and how might we do this. So, in relation to the 3 points, firstly, what I'd like to highlight to you all is the motivations for joining are both personal and political, and this should not come as a surprise to most of us. Secondly, we should not be too willing to dismiss women's violence by assuming somehow they are naturally peacekeeping. And thirdly, that the value of women's participation is both partly the symbolic value of their female bodies, but also because they can be more than that, as can men. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Denisa, for inviting me to participate in this panel, and thanks for coming. I wanted to start off contributing to the discussion today by just invoking the somewhat infamous question that Cynthia Enloe posed many years ago, which is, where are the women? And she asked that to find out what were women's roles in processes of militarization, ideologies of militarism. And she took this question quite seriously, and so did a whole range of scholars and journalists and so on. And so I take up also Katherine's question about the reasons why women join. I think that where are the women? We found the women in all sorts of places. We found the women to be both actively participating in war, resisting war. We found them to be preparing food, doing the mundane elements. And more recently, I think we found the media and the United Nations has promoted women in relation to their peacekeeping efforts. So I just wanted to share with you some of the kinds of questions and issues that I've been dealing with in my research on female peacekeepers. 2 images that I have on this screen are of female peacekeepers. You find not very many images. They tend to be highly militarized ones, but that's not surprising. So where do you find female peacekeepers? Well, it's not surprising that you find them in post-conflict spaces, and you find them in what some scholars have termed peacekeeping economies. And these are spaces, these are social spaces that are predominantly male-dominated in relation to the international personnel as well as the local business people. They are highly militarized, although you might not necessarily think that when you think of a peacekeeping space. Just to give you a kind of visual impression, in the early days of the peacekeeping mission in Kosovo, you had 15,000 military personnel arriving in the small city of Pristina, so you can just imagine the kind of the literal feel of the military of foreign military personnel, of peacekeepers in that space. And these spaces we found from quite a significant amount of academic research tell us that there are rife inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities, and in particular that there's a growing sexual imperialism within these contexts where you have incidences of sexual exploitation and abuse committed sometimes by military peacekeepers, but sometimes by civilian or other humanitarian workers against the local populations. So you find female peacekeepers in these unusual sites in some respects. Now, what I found with my research that's quite interesting is that the majority of female peacekeepers, and there's not a lot of them, especially the militarized ones, are from the global south. They're actually, you may have come across images, for example, of the Indian female peacekeepers who are in a 120 all-female squad in the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Liberia. This is them here at their medal parade. They are, this particular squad is overwhelmingly married. I think of 120, 118 were married, and the commander of the all-female squad told me that 2 that were not married were engaged, so that I wasn't to worry. They all have children, which is a very different image, I think, of a soldier, of a militarized individual than you might get if you think about a young soldier, a young male soldier, or perhaps even a young peacekeeper. They are also from the majority of police, often militarized police. So the Indian squad is from the Central Reserve Police Force. They're a riot control police squad. They are highly weapons trained. So they're not from the family and welfare units of police, of street policing. They are from these very specific kinds of units. So what do female peacekeepers do? Well, some of what Katherine just said is, I think, a little bit repeated in this, but they provide a very important symbolic antidote to what might be termed as a kind of very gender unequal space. But they often give the United Nations in particular a very good image because they say, look, we have female peacekeepers, we're on the right track. And they have lots of images of peacekeepers, which you'll find. Please do a Google search of female peacekeepers or women peacekeepers. And you can see the kinds of images that tend to be very common. Obviously, one of the hopes of the United Nations in deploying female peacekeepers or increasing the numbers of female peacekeepers is to reduce incidents of sexual exploitation and abuse. Again, female peacekeepers haven't been engaged in peacekeeping missions long enough for us to really get a good sense if that has been the cause of reduction, if there is any reduction in that. Obviously, the aim of deploying female peacekeepers is also to inspire local women, to inspire them to join the local and national police forces. I have to admit, having watched several medal parades in different peacekeeping missions, watching 120 women participating in what is generally a very male-dominated, austere ritual was incredibly inspiring, just because it was something that you really would never see in such a large critical mass capacity. Operationally, they're doing something quite interesting. They're doing, in Liberia, they're doing close protection work. So they're basically acting as a security force and as bodyguards for the Liberian president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. So they're trained specifically in that. And then their other main roles are to provide medical assistance. So they have a medical team within the both of the all-female squads. There's a Bangladeshi all-female squad in Haiti. They do similar work. And then they do educational work. So they do work with the local community. And I found out that the all-female squad also teaches Bollywood dance lessons. So there's a kind of an arts and cultural aspect to the education as well. But anyway, I think that it's interesting to see how peacekeepers survive and find work and find alternatives within these unequal contexts. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about their experiences, because we don't actually know a lot about female military personnel, and we don't know a lot about female peacekeepers, partly because there's not a lot of them deployed in all of the missions, although there is a percentage on the UN website that says 30% of peacekeepers are women, which is not quite accurate, because it's not 30% of the military by any means, and it's not 30% of the police. I'm not sure how they exactly calculate that. But what the all-female squad does, their experiences do tell us, is that women deployed in large groups in a critical mass can also face a sort of segregation. So these 120 women spend all of their time together. They live in sex-segregated quarters, so they don't live with the all-male squad. But they share some activities with them. They generally don't move about within the peacekeeping mission at all, unless they're in a large cohort. So one of the things that they actually fed back to the UN was that they're extremely isolated from other female peacekeepers. So some of the international experience that they gain is thwarted by this sort of isolation and segregation on their camp. They have to live up to a militarized masculine model, so in many ways they're no different than other female soldiers. You can see here one of the female peacekeepers from the squad is jumping through this ring of fire. This was a demonstration conducted at their medal parade to show just how brave and courageous and how much they are like their male peers in terms of embodying bravery and strength. They do have some very positive things to say. One is that they gain a lot from being in a large cohort and being together. There's a lot of security that they develop in that, being away from their families. And I think that the presence, as I said, of 120 women really does make a symbolic impact, and hopefully research can convince the UN to take this more seriously and to investigate what their experiences are. They gain international experience. This helps them with promotions and further work when they return home. A year abroad makes a considerable difference to their career prospects. And there's individual empowerment, that they said that they felt so much stronger and so much more empowered to take on different kinds of roles. They challenged concepts of themselves as merely dependent wives and mothers, and I think that they were very keen to share those very positive elements. So I just want to end by sort of saying, I guess that I would add to Katherine's point about the reasons that women join, being personal and political. Well, I would also look at the ways in which socioeconomic pressures make female military personnel continue to engage in this type of work. And one of the reasons why they continue to join the US military, despite these really horrific numbers of sexual assaults taking place inside, it's a very interesting paradox that I hope we'll be able to dwell on more in the questions.
Thank you very much. Yes. Okay, so I would now ask our speakers if they would like to make any comments in response to what they've heard.
I would.
Yes, and then we'll open it up.
Thank you so much, both of you. You both brought up points, I think, that are very relevant to looking at women in the military in the States. I would like to go a little bit back and talk about some of the other reasons they join and the view of themselves they have. In spite of these horrendous figures of assault. They join for the same reasons that men do. They join to be tough and get tougher. Maybe the one main difference is that a lot of them join because they don't want to fall into the typical feminine behavior they've been brought up in, and they want a way out. They join for economic reasons. You know, in the States, it's very, very, very expensive to go to university, and the military will pay your tuition. They joined to get American citizenship, which was instigated by Bush to get more bodies in the war in Iraq. They join because their families are in the military, or because they're very patriotic, or because they really believe it's a way of serving their country and doing good in the world. All those reasons, which are just the same as for men. And they see themselves as powerful and as strong, and indeed, the jobs they have are not all pushing pens in the back room and being a medic. They drop bombs from airplanes, and they drive. They've just been allowed in submarines now, and now they're in ground combat as well in the States. They do almost all the same jobs as men, with a few exceptions. I've heard a lot of them talk to me about, it's a myth that women aren't violent. It's a myth that we can't kill. Look at who are the most violent animals in the animal kingdom, one of them said to me. It's the mothers. I don't know if we like that image or not, but that's how they feel about it. And I also want to bring up something about segregation that you pointed out. Because a lot of people have said, if there's all this sexual assault and harassment, why not have all-female units? And I have not met a single female soldier in America who wants that. And I think it's because the history of what happened with African American, with black soldiers, which is they had segregated units and they were sent into the worst parts of the war, and they were ghettoized and not given full recognition and looked down upon and not given promotions and so on. And women feel they have fought long and hard to get out of that hole, and they don't want to be put back in it. I might also say that in spite of the invisible war and the recent publicity, most people still don't know how dangerous it is for women in the military, aside from war. And so a lot of them join without a clue of what they might be facing. And there's one more little point that I think I should bring up, which is the rape and sexual assault of men, which is extremely high in the military too. So just a little quick reminder about what rape and sexual assault are about, which is not uncontrolled lust. It's about degrading someone, taking their power away, humiliating them, making it clear that you don't want them there. The military is very cliquey. It's like a cross between prison and high school a lot of the time. The people are very young for the most part, and they form their cliques within their platoons, and if you are on the outside of the clique because you wear glasses or you read books, or they don't like your name, or they don't like your race, or they don't like your gender, or they don't like your sexuality, you will be bullied and left out. So, and one of the things that happens is the rape of men. We're finding out more and more that those numbers are horrifically high too.
Katherine, would you, or Marsha, would you like to respond to other comments?
Quick thing that's
Yes.
I think is quite interesting but possibly quite controversial is actually the similarities in the stories between people who join terrorist organisations and those that join militaries, and also the way in which why people stay as well, because it's not just a question of why do you join, but why do you stay, and what are the costs of staying and what are the costs of leaving, and also the reconstruction of your identity once you've joined, and how much you invest of yourself in these groups, both as women and as soldiers or as terrorists. And I think that's also really important.
Well, I think we have to be really careful with that. I would like to say that a great number of the soldiers who got deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan joined before those wars started, and a lot of them joined the National Guard and the reserves. The National Guard had not been deployed to a war since the Korean War in the 50s, so there was no reason for them to expect that they'd be going to war. They thought they'd be fighting floods and riots and things like happening now in Baltimore. So I couldn't say they were at all like somebody who wants to go to war because they feel it's it's a just cause.
Yeah, I suppose that's different in the US and the UK, depending on where you join.
And when.
Well, I think
If you join in peacetime.
Well, I think you open up actually very interesting inroad into this question, because what struck me was that your stories were basically apolitical, and the stories of women then joining these organizations is almost their political awakening, and it's really interesting whether in which direction it goes, whether to stick or actually to step back and to criticize. I think that, Helen, comes very well in your book, and even through this actually the survey that you quoted in your speech, where women were then seem to be more politically aware.
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember how many of them, how young a lot of them were when they were recruited from their high schools. A lot of them 17, 18, they didn't know where Iraq was or Afghanistan. They didn't know that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. They're not taught that kind of thing in America. And they had no idea, and the naivety was sad but touching. I mean, one of the things that broke my heart in my research is how idealistic so many of these young people were. And they believed it when they were told that they were going to go to Iraq, build schools and liberate women and make life better for the Iraqis. They had no idea that 50% of students in Iraq were women and 40% of the workforce was women, which we managed to undo, by the way, and that women had more human rights in Iraq than any other Muslim country outside of Turkey. They thought that everybody was being kept. It was more like the days of the Taliban. So they were idealistic. They were do-gooders, which may overlap with your peacekeepers a lot. They thought they were really going to help people, and it sounds very naive because war is war and it's about killing. But then they're 17, 18 years old, and they have no education about that part of the world.
And Marsha, just to ask you, to what extent your peacekeepers that you studied are aware, for example, in Kosovo, what kind of missions are they propping up? Because we study these missions in the context of neo-colonialism, and they don't just bring, they come with peace, but actually they bring a particular kind of peace, a particular kind of vision of a state that's got to be put in place. And as you refer to, there is lots of tensions with the local population. So where is the politics there?
In the research that I did on both the Indian peacekeepers and there's a large number of Uruguayan female peacekeepers in various missions because they have a particularly high number of women in the military more generally. And it was very interesting because, as I said, most of the female peacekeepers that you see are from global South militaries. Yes. And in fact, the question of sort of global class categories actually really comes out in their accounts, because they also believe that they were really helping people, but they also believed that they were superior to the people that they were, in a sense, the people that were being peace kept, in a sense. So, very often the interesting thing about the sex segregated group was that they thought that the mixed sex society was itself a kind of problem that related to the conflict. They saw the fact that they were sex segregated as a kind of indicator of being quite civilized and being really a proper sort of social military. And so I think that there is this issue about the ways in which these neoliberal and colonial agendas then end up, in a sense, being manifest in the very accounts of these, in other ways, colonized peacekeepers. So I think it's very much a paradox, I think. Yeah.
Well, I thought it would be a good moment to open it up to the audience. So we have 2 roving mics, so let us know if you would like to ask the question. Okay, we have one question there, and then we'll follow with the question here. Please introduce yourself.
So my name's Roshani. This is a question for Dr. Brown. Dr. Brown, you said that people join jihadist groups, or women join jihadist groups, for the same reasons that they joined the army. And yet Dr. Benedict's sort of reasons that people join, and also Dr. Henry's reasons that people join peacekeeping, are quite different. I mean, so what are the political reasons? What are the similarities? I mean, presumably not to make the world a better place. Or sort of, well, and also you used the word violence. I mean, state-sanctioned violence is quite a different way of seeing violence than the way jihadist organizations define violence. Mm-hmm. So I'd be quite interested to see what similarities.
So yeah, so when you look through the narratives of young jihad women who've travelled out to Iraq and Syria, and they're often quite young, actually they do believe they're making the world a better place, that they are about to join a utopian vision that will be better than whatever the West has to offer. So there is that naivety and that political ambition there. It is also the combination of the personal and the political. In the different discussions about socioeconomic deprivation, although the young women tend to be lower middle class and relatively well educated to their cohort, again, the discrimination and the structural Islamophobia that young women feel in the West is also a contributing factor, because then they're saying, this family doesn't want you, as in living in the West, but here, us Islamic State, we are your new family. And that again is quite similar to how the military operates, because it sets up a new family for you to belong to. And then thirdly as well, there is a sense of violence. And yes, I agree, the levels of violence are quite different, but on the other hand, the personalised violence isn't. And I would say that looking at the justifications for violence and the aggression of violence is interesting. What is different is whether that violence is sanctioned. So Abu Ghraib is seen as an anomaly, and then people are prosecuted for it. And so it's held up as a rotten apple effect. But also within Islamic State, when you read through some of the tweets and discussions that they have about people who've carried out certain acts of violence, such as raping a woman, they have very swift summary justice against the person who is alleged to do it. So again, there are certain ideas about what is justice and what is not. But that's not me saying their level of violence is correct. I'm not sympathising with them. I'm just trying to say that when we look at some of these things, it's not actually so far apart as one might imagine, although the individual stories are obviously different. Yeah.
Another question here.
My name's Louise Arimatsu. I actually wanted to kind of pick up on the last question, which kind of ties in with the first part of my question. And it was, I did notice that some of the speakers you went from, hey, you know what, and just talking about women here, why women get involved. And there was at one point an emphasis on it's about participating in a war-fighting sort of the organization versus actually, you know what, we want to go out there, we want to free women, we want to free the world, we want to save people. And I wonder whether in your research you found any kind of differentiation between these two conceptions of why people join the military, between men and women. Okay, are men's perceptions more about this sort of gung-ho, you know, I want to join my brothers out there to fight wars? And are women approaching their involvement in the armed forces for a whole set of subtly different reasons? And then this kind of brings me back to the core question that I wanted to raise, because you all described this trend that we've seen globally now for the increased participation of women as warriors, okay? And I wonder then, and this is a question to you individually, should we not be worried?
Well, it's hard to generalize about why people join the military. Everybody has their own reason. So I can't give you one reason. For some, it was about supporting their buddies, but that usually was after one deployment and they had formed their bonds. And in fact, one of the main reasons people would enlist to go back, even though they had lost faith in the war itself, was because they didn't want to let down the surviving members of their squads. They felt like wimps staying at home, and that was equally true for men and women. I don't think that a lot of them would see a contradiction between fighting a war and liberating women in the context of the Middle East. Of course, dropping bombs and mortaring and mowing down with machine guns indiscriminately men, women, and children isn't exactly liberating anyone. But that is not the way they see it, you know, that this is a bad dictator they had to get rid of. We had to get rid of, who was a threat to America and to England and to the UK. And then when he was gone, things would get better. I mean, that was completely, you know, a twisted line of reasoning, but it was the one being given us by the government and by the news, a lot of the news at the time, especially at the beginning. And a lot of people still believe that, of course. So those were some of the reasons that I heard about that. As for your punchline at the end, why should we be worried? Should we be worried? I will say that one of the things that attracted me to this subject was that the feminist side of me and the anti-war side of me were in total clash in this subject of women in the military, kind of irreconcilable. The best I can say about that is that I believe women should do any job they want to do, even if it's not a job I would ever want to do or want my daughter to do or my son for that matter. And I wish there were no wars, and I wish nobody ever joined the military. And I've just decided that's my position, even if they're somewhat contradictory, because it is contradictory.
I think you're right in levels of looking at trends towards women's participation. I find it interesting that sometimes feminism is blamed for this, that somehow because women have gotten used to equality in the West, therefore we have to blame feminism for women wanting and carrying out acts of violence, and this is therefore, feminism is blamed for everything from women's participation in gangs to women joining the military to male emasculation, and we get to blame a new F word, which is quite interesting. So I'd be worried in the sense of what does this mean for the feminist movement and this continuous labelling in that sense of it being bad yet again, and here's another thing to whack a stick over it with. But I digress slightly. I think what's interesting about women's participation in violence and whether it's an increasing trend is perhaps just an increasing willingness to see women. Because actually women have been participating in violence and in war throughout history. It's just often not recorded, or that their participation is dismissed as not war, as in camp soldiers or camp followers, camp wives, and they're reclassified through history rather than being recognised as soldiers or war making and war fighting. So in that sense, it's a good thing that women's recognition is there. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, maybe I'll just say two things and then carry on if there's additional questions. But one is about why people join, and I think what's required is an incorporation of thinking about female military personnel in general and military personnel who come from the margins of society, regardless of whether they're women or men, and the margins of the globe. I think thinking about that as a means for, thinking about the, as Amanda Chisholm calls it, the military labor chain, actually, about where soldiers are coming from, what sections of society, what are their backgrounds, what do they hope they'll get out of the military, if it's a livelihood, if it's security. Then, and I think that kind of tells you a bit about also who is the cheapest source of labor for the military-industrial complex or the peacekeeping industry. It turns out women are a good source of labor, but then it turns out that there's not that many in the military that they can use. So, just to give you a sense of the numbers in the Indian context, in the military itself, there are 1 million soldiers in the Indian military. So, just the size of that, 250,000 of those soldiers are on the Kashmiri border. So there's a huge labor pool, in a sense. And the women who are not in the military, but who are in the militarized police, there's a pool of about 9,000 women who can participate in these all-female squads. So when you say 120 women peacekeepers to, say, a Canadian military person, they're like, wow, that's amazing. That would basically be, all our female personnel. And when you see that 120 is really not a lot of personnel to have. So there's this, I think there's this labor issue that we need to investigate further. and to put it in the context of globalization more generally. I guess the other issue is about whether we should be worried. I mean, it's really interesting about what the women told me from the all-female squad about their families back home. And I mean, this slightly links to the military labor chain, because one of the arguments that has been used by the UN as to why they cannot recruit female peacekeepers has been because they have family responsibilities, or they have childcare, or they don't want to leave their families. And they've never said that about male peacekeepers who also have families and children and responsibilities, but this has been the major deterrent, apparently, for female peacekeepers. Well, most of the peacekeepers who I spoke to who are from South Asia and Southeast Asia have actually are older military personnel. They're not sort of young recruits, and they have available to them a whole network of family, of outsourced labor, of their own, you know, of a servant class actually readily available to take care of their children so that they can go out to international peacekeeping missions. So I think, in a way, we should be worried, but maybe not for the reasons that we initially think. Maybe not just for the reasons about whether we want militaries at all, but what are we going to do if we unpack those, and you know, what's going to happen to all those women?
One argument I've heard against worrying about it is, and this is just a theory, an argument, but if the military were half women instead of is 50, it's about 15% in the US and about 10% in the UK. Would we see as many atrocities committed against civilians, especially sexual assault and exploitation of the civilians of occupied lands? I would like to see a study of the Israeli military, for example. There probably is one, but I haven't found it, which is 50% women, and whether there's any kind of record of sexual atrocities against Palestinians. There's certainly lots of other things. Somebody else know that? Well, I'd love to know that, but I also know that the jobs aren't completely equal in that military either, between men and women. But perhaps that's a starry idea of women. So who knows? I want to mention, by the way, historically, that it's absolutely nothing new to have women fighting in wars. When you look at the history of guerrilla wars as opposed to governmental armies, it's a long history of women participating as combatants. It's only in the governmental military that they've been tiny numbers, and that it's a new thing to have so many.
Thank you. We have a question here.
Hi, thank you for such a wonderful talk. I think all
Can you
war...
introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, hi, I'm Get Your Share on Twitter. All war is insanity. Anyone who promotes war or profits from endorsing rape, and there can be no question against that. And in the army, it's promoted to dehumanize the individual. So to try and find justice in a framework of such horror is just, it's unbelievable. But I mean, I also wish you all the luck. I think it would be much more interesting, and would you agree with this point, to be fighting to end war permanently in our societies, and against mainly, which is the church, and gross profit, which comes from these activities.
Thank you.
We should do it all. It doesn't have to be an either or. I mean, if we can ever end war in the world forever, it'd be great. But meanwhile, we've got a big problem on our hand that's right now, so I don't think it's an either or. However, you do bring up a really deep conflict in this whole proposition to try and end sexual assault in the military, which is that the military is an inherently violent organization, as you just said. And we're teaching everybody in it to kill. And we're telling them you can kill, but you can't rape. Rape is an international war crime. And of course, you can say, well, there's a difference between you're not allowed to kill your own comrades either, and you're certainly not allowed to rape them. But what about the enemy? You're allowed to kill the enemy, but you're not allowed to rape them. So that's an interesting challenge to pose to a soldier who's been trained to be a killing machine when called for.
you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think there are some really interesting debates happening about whether the objective of war is to kill or whether it's to conquer, and whether in fact the revolutionary military affairs has meant that actually through hybrid warfare we're looking for something slightly different. Which means that for peacekeepers, for example, and for peace enforcement operations, for peace support operations, we have this whole new idea about what war is. And we have to question that, which I think is really, really interesting about where Marsha's work comes in, about what happens when we look at the women who participate in this. Does it challenge our idea that somehow we've sanitized war? And I think some of this language around peace enforcement and peacekeeping might suggest that we are attempting to do the impossible, which is that.
Thank you. Marsha, if you have nothing to add, we have a question there. And then, yeah, young lady here. It's there.
Thank you for that. I'm Harriet. I'm a PhD student here at the LSE. I was just wondering if you could say anything about whether you think there is a comparable problem with sexual assault and harassment in the UK armed forces. Because obviously there was the Anne-Marie Element case which suggests that it is a problem, but do we know whether there's the same kind of level of issues, whether there's the same kind of cover-ups happening, or whether it might actually be less of an issue, and if so, why? Thanks.
Yes, of course.
We don't know to the same extent because the studies haven't been done. But there are some preliminary studies that have been done. There have been some kind of haphazard collections of surveys that have shown very high rates of harassment and assault. But one of the things I'm hoping is that my play and this discussion and whatever comes out of it will trigger more of an investigation. As I mentioned earlier, the military is a very defensive, closed organization, and it doesn't like anybody knowing its business. And that's just as true here as in the States. So it takes a lot. Also, soldiers do sign a gag rule when they join, which means that they're not entirely free to say whatever they want about what goes on in the military. If anything they say is deemed as being a threat in some way to the military security, they can be court-martialed. So it's hard, as I said, to be a whistleblower. It's hard to be a journalist and get in there and find out. We did speak to MP Madeleine Moon, a Labour MP who represents Wales, part of Wales, and she has heard, because she works on the Defence Committee, she has heard many, many accounts of horrendous sexual assault and harassment in the military, and not one of the women or men who's told her these things has been willing to come forth for an investigation. So that's sort of where it stands right now. But it's there waiting to be uncovered.
We have another question there. It's this lady.
Thanks. No, I was just curious, and maybe you touched on this a bit, Helen, but I was just curious as to whether there have been any comparative studies when conscription is involved as opposed to it being a choice to join the military. And I'm just thinking, you know, obviously there's the Israel example, and I'm going to show my ignorance here, but, you know, I don't know what the position was in Nazi Germany with females joining the military as well as the males. But I was interested in what you were saying about the benefits that come with joining the US military, and how that both creates an incentive, but also, and maybe this is more evident amongst the male soldiers, a sense of privilege as well, that somehow, you know, to then have your university education paid for and to have certain privileges beyond retirement from the military, which I think exists in the US, is part of the problem. And I presume in situations where conscription is the main order of recruiting military? I'm just be curious to know what the differences are.
Well, when I dug up all these surveys about sexual assault in the military, I did find that that in the States it's been studied since the Vietnam War, when there was a draft, when there was conscription. And even back then, the rates were pretty high. They do seem to be higher now. But the trouble is with military surveys is that they change the rules every year. You know, they change how many people they look at, how they question. So it's not very scientifically valid, and you can't really compare that easily. However, it does look as if with a voluntary military, there's a certain faction of men who will join the military because they're attracted to violence, which may be disproportionate compared to a draft where everyone had to go, as long as they passed the physical fitness test. And there's some other elements too, you know, that indicate that a voluntary army is quite different than a non-voluntary army, which makes sense, which may be contributing. And as I said at the beginning, the fact that half of the enlisted have come from violent homes. I mean, it is known in psychological studies that when boys are abused, they quite often can grow up into being abusers. So that might contribute. And the final thing is that during the Iraq War under Bush, the standards of what would stop you getting in the military were lowered enormously. So they were taking in people with criminal records, including violent and sexual violence in their background, which had never been allowed before.
I think the other thing to add might be also to look at what it is about wider American culture that contributes to that, and not just what it is about the military culture. I mean, one of the things that is quite interesting when we have a guest lecture by Dr. Paul Kirby from Sussex in my gender and militarization class, one of the things that he puts up is the statistics for the number of sexual assaults taking place within the US military by service personnel against their colleagues. And that is then put in comparison to the number of sexual assaults and rapes committed in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And students are often very surprised because they have a view, as I do as well, that, you know, sexual violence and conflict is taking place in these numbers, and then when you find out that it's taking place within a military that's not at war with itself, technically, I think that disrupts it. So maybe actually the starting point for some of the comparative analysis could be to actually look at what's happening in US culture and, you know, and sort of use that as the starting point rather than looking at, you know, sort of potentially feeding into problematic narratives about what happens with sexual assault in other parts of the world. So maybe that's, you know, it's worth doing a really large kind of comparative study of militaries and thinking about assault within them.
We have one question here and one over there, and after which I'll ask our speakers for maybe closing remarks.
Thank you. Mary Martin from LSE. You've spoken about women in state-armed forces, in armed groups, and in peacekeeping forces. What about private security contractors? Because as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan with drawdowns, there are more private contractors there now than state military forces and so on. And for men, you know, they can very lucratively transition into those kind of private forces. Do you have any evidence that women are doing the same? And does that shed light on women's economic role, their motivations, and all the things you've been talking about tonight?
A colleague of mine is researching women's involvement in private security firms and security contractors, and I've had the interesting experience of listening to some of the transcripts, the audio recordings of the interviews, and I think the crossover between militaries and private security contracting firms is really, really interesting, because often they're former military personnel, and all they've done is move from one group to another. But what's interesting is that they lose a sense of family. because they know that if they work for a private security contractor, there's no backup. Whereas when you work within the military, there's a perception of backup. Someone's always got your back. And of course, that's very problematic when we then take into account Helen's research about, well, really, have they got your back? And to what extent? And maybe a bit too close. But those issues there are really interesting about private security contractors. But the women that I've heard speak predominantly work in back offices, not in the front line, and not in combat type roles. So there's a difference there. But
yeah, I was just thinking about some of the work that people have been doing on private security contractors. Really difficult to get access to them at all, but women in general tend not to be working in the close protection type bodyguard work. But what I think is really interesting is that there's new research being conducted on the wives in the UK, the wives and families that are basically doing all of the reproductive and sustenance labor of keeping private military contractors, in the right condition to go back. And so I think that there's a lot of gender work going on, but it just happens to be, I think it's a lot of remote work that's being done, but it's really interesting work about how private security contractor families actually perceive this work. In fact, they see it as highly vulnerable, insecure work, whereas they see the military work as much more secure, and that they felt that they were a part of it, whereas they're really on the outside. They don't have a chaplain, they don't have a military liaison officer to speak to. The other thing is that I think private security contractors, it's very difficult to find out about their acts of violence and to follow up and to hold them accountable. Although there is increasing law and increasing policies developed, I think it's quite difficult to access it.
I mean, there have been a couple of notorious cases in the States of women private contractors who were horribly abused by their colleagues that have come to light and gone to court. Until recently, private contractors, there was a law that we put down in the States that protected them from being prosecuted for anything they did while they were in Iraq. And that just got lifted, and a group of men have just been convicted, as you may know. But otherwise, I think what you say is absolutely right. The only thing to add is that when they make that move from the military to private contracting, they earn a lot more money. That's the big law of it.
Okay, and our last question.
Hi, my name is Dana, and I'm a master's degree student in conflict studies here at LSE. Professor Benedict made a comment earlier about the rhetoric that's sort of fed into recruitment about liberating women in war zones, and I was wondering if there's any known correlation between that rhetoric and sexual violence against those women. So if there's any connection sort of between liberating these women and then committing acts of sexual violence against women who are perceived to come from a very sexually repressed society.
Well, that's an interesting question. I have no idea. I've never come across such research. So I just don't know. But I will say that I don't think anybody, except for a few wide-eyed teenage recruits, believed that much. And especially, what I did hear from a lot of the soldiers I interviewed were complaints about how the men treated them and looked at them, and the resentment of the local men towards, as they call them, the locals, towards them as female soldiers. And this was touched on before. They really resented having female prison guards. They treated the women prison guards much worse than the male prison guards. So I heard a lot about that. But, and they were used to, of course, search women. But I haven't heard anything. I don't know anything about whether that rhetoric creates more violence.
Would you like to make any sort of closing remarks? Any thoughts? Anything you might like to add?
Maybe just to say, the other common theme that came up amongst the female peacekeepers was really that they invested very heavily in talking about themselves as naturally more peaceful individuals, even though they were trained in these extreme weapons and martial skills, and then they put on these public demonstrations. One of the pictures I didn't have up is of them blindfolded, assembling and reassembling weapon, and so there were all these sort of performances of this extreme military presence. But in their oral accounts, they talked about how they believed women were more peaceful and better at negotiating things, and so I think it's really interesting to think about the question of how these different ideas about women and men circulate within these kinds of contexts, and how useful they might be. I mean, because really you have to justify why you're there and your usefulness to the military. And so I think female personnel will use a lot of contradictory kinds of ideas in order to justify them being there. Yeah.
I would like to say that what is interesting in these discussions is a question about the extent to which we, on the one hand, wish to promote women's participation as a matter of gender equality and justice, and yet on the same hand try and deal with this issue, but these are violent institutions and that violence appears endemic within it. And what that seems to me about is looking at gender hierarchies and gender power relations, and looking, I think it's really important not just to look at women in combat or women in the military or women in terrorist groups in isolation, but actually looking at their relations with men as well, and looking at how those two play together in order to produce these somewhat paradoxical questions.
Well, very true that one of the things that's so fascinating about looking at the military is that it's like putting society under a magnifying glass or a microscope, and enhanced by war. But the people's behavior, and whether it's class, race or gender, is all sort of becomes magnified and very visible. But otherwise, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. I do urge you to go see my play. It's not all about sexual assault. Actually, it is about the Iraq War and war in general, and how war changes people. It's in 3 acts. So you meet the women before they went to war, why you hear why they enlisted. Then there's to Act 2, which is while they're at war, and Act 3 when they come home. So it is an arc very much about what war does to us, both as participants, direct participants, and as those who are affected all around them. So do come, and thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, in these couple of minutes that we have, I won't even attempt to summarize our discussion, because we took it from the motivations, through looking at the institutions, the effects on society, politics, etc. But I would like to say that working on a research proposal recently, I received an email from a collaborator who said, "Oh, but could someone do a little bit about gender in there?" And that just reminds me that what happens with gender is something that is always kind of tagged on, that has to be done. And our discussion actually shows that if you focus on gender, you not only learn more about position or perspective from the perspective, let's say, of women or men, for that sake, from a gender perspective, but actually you begin to learn more about the nature of things like war. So you really truly cannot understand what's going on without that perspective there at the foreground, including politics. And this also comes very strongly in your book. I have forgotten to say in introductions that Helen actually has an LSE connection, and that she's almost one of us, or let's say, because her father was a lecturer here for a long time. So I thought that was really special. And I think we had this brief discussion, and he really would have been proud to know that you spoke here. And I think also about your work, which has been very, very brave. It has changed women, I mean, the lawsuits, but also this whole debate is, I mean, I believe it is changing things. So you were reminded about the play, but I would also add that Helen's book is on the sale as you go out, if you would like to buy a copy. So once again, I would like to thank all our panelists, both Katherine and Marsha. I would like to thank Praveen and our actors, and of course the audience for your excellent and sometimes tough questions. Thank you very much.